Hello, tea friends. 一茶会友. Through tea, make friends. Welcome to the first video in our new series, which we're going to call Gongfu Tea. This is all about Gongfu tea brewing. We're going to keep it in a separate playlist from our ordinary brewing tea videos, which we'll reserve for more general information regarding all of tea practice and bowl tea and those kinds of things. In this series, we'll then be able to focus exclusively just on Gongfu tea brewing. In this first installment, we're going to talk about the history and some of the philosophy and context in which this brewing method arose. Some of this will be general and abstract, but as you'll see in future videos, a lot of this does have actual practical applications that will improve your ability to brew tea, which is the focus of all these brewing tea and Gongfu tea videos, all of us growing in our tea practice together. So put on a kettle, get out your Gongfu tea ware, let's drink some cups and explore the history, context, and philosophy of where Gongfu tea comes from. Before we dive into the history, origins, and some of the philosophy that informs Gongfu tea, I think it's important to define the term itself. Gongfu means anything where there's mastery through self-discipline. We often use, in the West, we use the Cantonese Kung Fu to talk about martial arts, which are certainly a kind of Gongfu. They are a kind of practice that is mastery through self-discipline. The way of Tea Cha Dao is a path of self-discipline. So mastery through self-discipline is kind of the essence of what this word Gongfu means. And you can use it in Chinese sentences to talk about anything that requires self-discipline. That could even be like carpentry or pottery or, of course, tea brewing, martial arts, things like this. So it is about the tea becoming a way of life, a way of living, a living beauty, a way of practicing tea and living a life of tea. And so as that self-discipline arises and mastery starts to grow, we start to become the practice, and the practice starts to become us. And this is kind of what the meaning of Gongfu is. It's the difference between, we say like someone makes cabinets and someone is a cabinet maker. So you can make cabinets for lots of reasons. You can do it for money or because your father did it. But when you are a cabinet maker, it starts to become what you are. And then included in that cabinet making is a way of approaching a human life and a way of approaching the world in which that life is lived. And so that starts to become the practice, and the practice starts to become the life, and the life starts to become the practice. And this is what makes it a Dao. This is what makes it a Gongfu, when you start to be it instead of just doing it. So it's not tea as a kind of pastime or plaything, but more as a way of self-cultivation. And so this is kind of the real essence and etymology of the word Gongfu. But in the modern era, the word Gongfu it is loosened up, and it's come to mean kind of just brewing in a Chinese way, which is fine. Language changes, and the definitions and meanings of words, slowly evolve over time. And so nowadays, you'll hear the word Gongfu thrown around very loosely and very often to talk about any method of brewing tea that is essentially Chinese. And so if you'll see Chinese Gongfu tea, this ceremony, that ceremony, or even not ceremony, just playing, and it's called Gongfu tea. And I don't have any issues with using the word that way, but the original meaning of the word was a little bit deeper and held a little bit more spirit and essence. And so I think it's important, if you're serious about a practice of Gongfu tea, to understand those kinds of roots and origins and understand where it comes from. And though it has evolved into a slew of different brewing methods also, everything that, you can travel to the north of China, you go to Beijing, go to some tea shops, you go to Shanghai, you go to Taiwan, you go to Hong Kong, and they're all going to say they're practicing Gongfu tea, and you'll notice the teaware is very different, the methods are different, and of course traditions evolve over time and change. Ours has as well. And if they're rooted in the origins of Gongfu tea, I think that even a lot of those changes and adaptations can be incredible and beautiful and help to push things forward and evolve. But some of them aren't rooted. They're based in marketing or popular trends or commercialism. They're not really based in the roots of Gongfu tea, which I think it's important to understand, which is why starting out with a discussion of the context and history of Gongfu tea is important and why it arose. Because actually, as I mentioned, later on when we do get into the practical details of Gongfu tea, a lot of this contextual stuff will matter and it will make a difference in our ability to do things. One philosophical aspect of Gongfu tea and all tea brewing that I really like to contemplate is the idea that the methods are in the tea and in the tea ware themselves. They're in the utensils and they're in the tea itself. So it's not, these aren't like human contrivances and human creations for interacting with this plant in a specific way that we arbitrarily want. But that these are the boiled down essence of what happens when people do things repetitively for centuries. And when you do things repetitively, even within a lifetime, and you start to achieve that mastery, the mastery that is Gongfu tea through self-discipline, and you do that through lots of practice, slowly as you use the utensils and learn to see and use. These are the two kind of skills of tea, which we can talk about in a minute. But when you learn to see and use, you slowly over time, you get to the essence of the way that those utensils want to be used, or their most efficient use, their best use, their inner nature, their essence, their way, their law, their nature. And so it's no longer an individuality. It's no longer just you deciding how you want to do things, right? So there's a lot of people that, you know, the utensils don't really matter and how they're used don't really matter. But when you start to achieve mastery and you start to really get into the refinement of how things should be used, there is a way that they are used. In basketball players shoot with one hand on the side of the ball and one hand behind it. I don't play basketball, but there's a reason for that. And that reason has been cultivated over decades, or as long as basketball has been played. There is physics in it. There's the nature and size of the ball and its relationship to the human body. So some of these methods, they're not just arbitrary creations that have ceremonial significance. They are also deeply practical and deeply inherent in the nature of the tea and in the nature of the tea ware. So that the masters over time, over generations, are cultivating a very, very deep and powerful relationship to the tea and tea ware, and the way to use it that is in the greatest harmony with its essence, right? And that's why tradition is so important, because within the lifetime of one human being, the memory is short, and the amount of discipline that you can cultivate isn't as great as when you start connecting to past and future generations. When you start binding that bridge of past generations and their wisdom, informing the current generation, which then evolves it and grows it and passes all of it then on to the next generation. And that kind of tradition creates the forms that slowly over time are a boiling down of the essence of that thing. And so you get to the deep, deep, deep essence of the seeing and using. And seeing means the ability to choose the right tea and to evaluate tea, in other words, which is a huge part of Gongfu tea, knowing how to evaluate tea, knowing how to find tea. And then, of course, choosing the right utensils. So the right tea and the right utensils, this is the seeing, the discernment of the practice. And then the using is knowing the method, knowing how to use the things, right? But I think it's important that we contemplate and think about the fact that these traditional ways of using the teaware aren't just arbitrary creations that somebody sat down someday and made up just for the purpose of making up something that happens to have ceremonial significance, but rather over centuries of practice, they are a distillation of the essence of the way that the things are meant to be used. And this is why tradition is important, because otherwise, of course, what's being practiced now might very little resemble what was practiced 200 years ago, because of the evolution and development, which is important. As the landscape changes, as the situation changes, as life changes, the traditions must adapt and grow and facilitate the life ways of the humans who are practicing them, because the tradition is alive in the flesh and blood of those who practice it. But also at the same time, even though there's not a resemblance, there's the same distillation and growing refinement over time of those things. And so, if you go too much to the size, to the level of like, oh, it doesn't matter, I'll just, do things however, then you're into like a pastime and more of a hobby, which is fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but that's less of a Gongfu. And if you go to the other extreme, what happens is then the forms lose their spirit and the ability to see and use is gone, and what you have left is just this hollow formula or method for doing things. This happens to a lot of traditions, and then the tradition gets stuck and dies and isn't living and growing and breathing. So it's got to be a way of seeing and a way of using, not just a form, not just a formula, not just some list of things that is disembodied in a book or in language, but an actual living and breathing way of seeing and way of using. So this is, for me, why talking about also history and context is really important. So the history of Gongfu tea begins in the southern part of China, and it really starts for 3 reasons. We're going to talk about all those 3 reasons, and they will all have significance in practical videos that we do at a future date. So Gongfu tea began as a local brewing method. China is a huge place, and there has always been a huge diversity of brewing methods, just as there is today. The difference is nowadays that big diversity of brewing methods tends to be under the umbrella of the word Gongfu tea. I have no problem with that. There's nothing, that's just the evolution of the language and the term. And technically, if one is practicing cultivation and self-discipline, then any of those brewing methods technically could be considered Gongfu tea. But there was a time when Gongfu tea was one local brewing method. I think it's dangerous. A lot of historical texts and books, especially in English, tend to oversimplify brewing methods in a misleading way and say that, like, in the Tang Dynasty they boiled tea, in the Song they whisked it, and then in the Ming they brewed it. This is very misleading because China's always been a vast place with lots of ethnicities and lots of brewing methods. And so when you say in the Tang they boiled tea and in the Song they whisked tea, Aboriginal people in Yunnan, even in the Song Dynasty, were not whisking tea with a bunch of expensive accoutrements that were made, highly refined and made and following such kinds of forms. They were following their traditional brewing methods. Even the Ming Dynasty, the first emperor, Taizu, who outlawed powdered tea and made, caused people to start steeping tea a lot, again, increased the popularity of that. He did that because he was actually he's an amazing emperor. He was a farmer and then a monk and then an emperor. So his life's amazing. You should read about him. But he, his whole life he had been drinking simple steeped tea, and so he thought that was good enough. It's good enough for him. It's good enough for everybody. And there were economic reasons for making that shift too. But that shift didn't happen immediately. People continued to whisk tea for a long, long time, even after he passed away. Even though it was technically, the production of it was technically outlawed. So there's always been a lot of different brewing methods. And when we say that people brewed tea in the way that Lu Yu suggested in the Chajing in the Tang Dynasty, we mean that the mainstream literati, the mainstream nobles, the wealthy, the ones who write history, the literate, they were brewing tea that way. It was popular amongst them. And in the Song Dynasty, it was popular amongst a lot of people to whisk tea, but not everybody. This is akin to saying, like, in the 1960s, Americans wore bell-bottoms. Certainly, it was popular, but not everybody did. My grandfather never did. So these are trends that were popular at those times, not necessarily represented the entirety of the the tea experience all throughout China. So that's why that can be a little bit misleading. But in the Ming Dynasty, most people in China were actually brewing tea in large pots and large cups, steeped for a long time. While they were, artists, scholars like to talk, they like that large steeping, large pot, large cups, and steeping for a long time. That actually is the time when the West came in contact with China, right? After Vasco da Gama went around the Cape of Good Hope and made his way to India, then immediately, only 20 years later, the first boat was in a Chinese harbor. And that was the most popular brewing method at that time, which is why that brewing method made its way to the West and still is the predominant method of brewing in the Western world even to this day. Large pots, large cups. Western people invented the little handle on the cup, but otherwise very similar to those days until now. That's the Western so-called Brown Betty brewing style, because that was the most popular style of brewing in the Ming Dynasty, and so it's what the Westerners mostly encountered when they first started trading with China. So in the early Qing Dynasty, basically around the time of the Emperor Qianlong, who's a beautiful emperor, also you should go read about him, this brewing method began in the south of China, in Chaozhou, in Guangdong, but very quickly spread to Fujian and Taiwan. It's these kind of regions where Gongfu tea thrived and kind of had its origins, though the kind of real specific origin place is Chaozhou in Guangdong. And at that time, this was a really local brewing method that just started in these areas and was practiced there, and the rest of China was brewing tea in other ways, mostly in those large pots with large cups, etc. And it began kind of for three reasons. And these three reasons all have their depth. So we could probably make an hour-long video about each of the three factors that kind of were the greatest influence on Gongfu tea as it evolved. There are, of course, other influencing factors. And as we started our discussion by talking about how, these methods aren't just arbitrary creations that simply have ceremonial significance. They also have deep essence boiled into them. So these traditions, tea traditions didn't arrive out of nowhere. They are born on the tea traditions before them, and they evolved and developed out of those. So it's not like Gongfu tea began in the Qing Dynasty. It began whenever you want to start, when tea begins. And then it slowly evolved and eventually evolved into Gongfu tea. And there are a lot of factors that made that happen, but three big ones, three very relevant ones that will apply to actual practice when you do start practicing Gongfu tea. So all three are very important to talk about. So the first major influencing factor of Gongfu tea is martial arts. And this connects Gongfu tea to the previous lineages of tea as well, because they say martial arts was also born in the Zen monastery. Like the mainstream of China was introduced to tea through the Zen monastery. So we have this long marriage of Zen and tea. We even say tea and Zen one flavor, cha cha and yi wei. So through the martial arts, we get some of the philosophy and cosmology that stands as the backdrop for Gongfu tea, and the way of life that Gongfu tea is about, the self-discipline and practice and all of that, comes from a Chinese cosmology, and then the martial arts practices of the southern part of China there. There was a lot of Tai Chi, Qigong, martial arts lineages, as well as Zen temples and practitioners down there as well. So a lot of that Chinese cosmology is really important to almost all the lineages of tea. Right? We read books like Lu Yu's Cha Jing, and we assume that it's just some kind of practical manual in the way that we would get a manual for a new camera or something and just listing its functions. But we have to remember that Lu Yu didn't live in a materialistic world. He didn't live in a world of scientific method. He lived in a Chinese cosmology. He lived with a working mythology. He lived with rites and rituals and ceremonies in his daily life, in his annual calendar. And he lived with beliefs in immortals in the mountains, and qilings and dragons and the gods in the sky. And all of that was the context within which this manual was operating. So understanding Chinese cosmology, and then within that cosmology, martial arts, is very important to the philosophy and practice of Gongfu tea. Cosmologically, this means understanding yin and yang, understanding the five elements, understanding the basis, on which Chinese people viewed the world and how it worked with them, and the elements, which are all very essential in tea brewing, and especially Gongfu tea, understanding the alchemy of the elements, which you could maybe talk about in a future video. And then the movements of Gongfu tea, the movements that, they come out of Qigong, they come out of Tai Chi, they're born of the same body. And of course they are, because we're talking about living a discipline, and a discipline as a way of life. So, these dudes, if they're practicing Tai Chi, that Tai Chi and Qigong, of course, is influencing their tea practice, and their tea practice is influencing their Tai Chi and Qigong. Their life, the whole life is a cultivation. They want to do everything in that way. They want to eat in that way, walk in that way, see in that way, and of course brew tea in that way. So tea is a way of distilling Zen truths, Taoist truths. It's a way of, and maybe you could say indirect way of both cultivating and expressing those deep insights. It's a way of living the insights of both Zen and Taoism and those kinds of philosophies. It's a way of living them. In that way, the contemplation of a teapot is no less powerful than the contemplation of a gatha from a sutta. So this cosmology and martial arts is a huge influencing factor, and forms the kind of context and backdrop of a lot of tea traditions, including Gongfu tea. And so this influencing factor is important. The second large influencing factor is economy. These people in the South were poorer than the people in the North in the capital. They had less money, and those large pots and large cups and large amounts of tea were not economic for them. They wanted small amounts of tea in small pots, brewed in a way that you could be satisfied in one session, so you didn't have to consume large amounts of tea all day and have lots of money to do it. But this isn't also just about poverty in terms of lack of money. It's also poverty in the kind of spiritual aesthetic sense as well, which in the Ta Ching, Lu Yu says that the spirit of tea is poverty, is simplicity, frugality. And so poverty in terms of Zen, in terms of Christianity also, in terms of like a spiritual practice, a form of self-discipline, doesn't really have to do with a lack of money. It has to do with two things. First of all, being simple and humble, and also consciously and actively forsaking worldly desire. So, that's really what the spirit of poverty is keeping humble and keeping simple and unadorned, and also consciously cultivating forsaking of worldly desires. And that kind of poverty and simplicity also is an influencing factor in almost all tea traditions, and also Gongfu tea. So you have a literal poverty in the sense of a lack of money of these people in the South. They tended to be more poor and wanted a brewing technique that was simpler, which steeping tea kind of began in that way too. We talked about Ming Taizu, the first emperor. We have a beautiful article all about him in Global Tea. You can now search in our archive and past issues and find out about that, and how he went from a peasant to a monk to emperor, which is a sensational and outstanding story. There's nothing like it in the rest of Chinese history. And so the steeping of tea was already born of a desire to simplify, and because the economy of whisk tea wasn't as sustainable, because it takes a lot more labor and the yield is a lot less. So he wanted to increase yield for less labor and save, and keep things simple and economic. So the shift from large pots and large cups, which was the most popular mainstream brewing method at the time, the shift from that to small pots and small cups was also just a continuing of that trend of simplicity and economy, and both external poverty in terms of a lack of funds, and internal poverty in terms of a conscious cultivation of simplicity and forsaking of worldly desires that corresponds to the philosophies of Zen and Taoism and those things that we talked about in the first influencing factor. So we have the martial arts and the Chinese cosmology, and then we have the economy. And the third great influencing factor that created Gongfu tea is the creation of oolong tea. Oolong tea also began at this time. In fact, there's some debate between scholars. We don't actually know if the term Gongfu was first applied to oolong tea and tea processing methods, or brewing. Personally, I don't think it matters very much, but the evidence tends to lean towards the tea and not to the tea brewing. So oolong tea began, of course, in Wuyi in the north of Fujian. In Wuyi Mountain, cliff tea was the first oolong tea. And this was the most complicated and skillful of all tea production. And just like all the things that we've talked about so far with tea brewing, the same applied for that processing. It is mastery through self-discipline. It also comes out of Chinese cosmology and martial arts, even in the rolling, even in the movements that are used to process the tea. And it also has to do with economy. So the same influencing factors. And there's a really good chance that first Gongfu tea referred to oolong tea. It referred to tea that requires a lot of skill to process. Every tea has a ratio of its quality that is built upon the raw material, the terroir, the environment, the weather, that kind of thing, and the processing skill of the producer. And some ratio of these create the quality of tea. In pure tea, it's almost all the environment, the trees, the weather, the terroir, and little to do with the processing. But in oolong, it's at least 50-50. So the skill of the gongfu of the producer is incredibly relevant. So that processing method, the word gongfu, most probably first applied to cliff tea. It applied to oolong tea, was Gongfu tea, because it required so much skill and self-discipline and mastery to produce. It takes decades to get to the level where you can process by hand oolong tea very, very well on a consistent level. That literally takes decades. The family that I stay with in Wuyi, the son has just recently taken over the supervision of production after 3-4 decades of helping his father. So it takes a long time and a lot of self-discipline and cultivation to reach a level where you can process that tea well. And the more cultivated you are, the better you'll be at it. Just like in Gongfu tea brewing, the more cultivated you are as a human being, the better you'll be at doing this. So it's very likely that Gongfu tea first referred to the tea processing of oolong tea. And then, of course, a brewing method had to evolve that was in the spirit of Gongfu tea. So Gongfu tea, as oolong tea, required so much skill to process. We needed a brewing method that honored that skill, that showed up in a way that was equal to that skill, that showed up with an equivalent skill, that took all of that skill that was used to produce the tea and process the tea with such beauty and extraordinariness. Now we need a brewing method that can bring the best out of it to finish that process. So it's like if you have a really high quality vegetable that somebody really put a lot of time and energy and tradition and love and skill and mastery into growing, and it's very unique. We don't just want to randomly throw that in a pot and cook it. We want to have somebody who's skilled at cooking that kind of vegetable, who can show up and honor all the work that went into it and finish that process, finish it to its completion, because the raw tea is an unfinished product. It still needs to be brewed. And so, of course, if the tea was processed very simply, then we would want to brew it very simply. But if the tea was processed with great skill and intricacy and refinement, we would want to show up with that kind of brewing method to bring out those qualities from it into the cup. And so this dance between oolong tea and Gongfu brewing most likely started with the tea and the processing of the tea in this very refined way, and then a brewing method evolved that equaled that refinement and brought that refinement out. So these are the three main factors that caused Gongfu tea and that it evolved out of course, and also the previous tea traditions, it evolved out of those as well. So if you understand the kind of some Chinese cosmology and the martial arts, and you can have some of that practice in your body, like the movement of qi and things, and that a lot of those movements inform the movements of Gongfu tea. And then the economy, the simplicity, the poverty, both external and internal. And then, of course, what is the most predominant influencing factor is oolong tea. And the Gongfu even came Gongfu tea and then Gongfu tea brewing, and they became synonymous over time. So oolong tea plays a big role in the creation of this brewing method. In future videos in this Gongfu tea series, we will certainly take some of this philosophy and context and we'll bring it down to earth and apply it to some actual practical advice that you can use to improve your Gongfu tea practice. But it is important to move from the general to the specific and understand some of the context. That said, though this video might seem long to some of you, it is really a very brief overview, and we passed over a lot of really deep things very, very quickly. So all of these things actually need to be explored both through learning and experientially to a much greater depth. If you're interested in exploring these things deeper, please help us by subscribing to Global Tea Hut. Our magazine is full of such information. It comes every month and it's 60 pages of ad-free tea wisdom, including lots of information like the things that we've been talking about here. In fact, recently we just translated 2 articles from one of the most important books on Taiwanese tea history, and it includes a huge section on Gongfu tea, written by one of the most prominent tea scholars alive today, certainly one of the most prominent in Taiwan. And we're really excited to offer such translations in almost every issue of Global Tea Hut. So Global Tea Hut isn't just a mouthpiece for our lineage. We're exposing readers to information from all kinds of tea scholars and tea authors. As we move forward, we will continue to do that, translating classics, annotating them, and translating modern authors, and bringing lots of voices and lots of tea wisdom to you, the reader, so you can grow in your understanding of tea. Global Tea Hut also comes every month with tea. All the teas that we send are sustainably produced, and they're all beautiful, so you can learn through drinking and reading at the same time. And finally, Global Tea Hut is also a beautiful community of people around the world. We have an app so that people can connect, ask questions, and grow together. And speaking of growing together, make some comments below this video. Let's talk and discuss these issues and learn as we move forward. Also, finally, all of this supports our free center here in Taiwan. We host 2 10-day courses every month, and all of you are welcome to come and join us and stay for 10 days, learn about tea and a life of tea as we grow and explore together. These courses are 100% absolutely free. And all of this content, videos, podcasts, magazine, and the center itself, all this content is supported through the donations and subscriptions to our magazine, Global Tea Hut. So please, if you haven't yet, subscribe and get this beautiful magazine. And if you're already a member, help us spread the word and grow subscriptions so we can grow this project, all of which helps to serve you and serve tea herself. So until next time, put on a kettle, get out some Gongfu tea, and drink some beautiful cups of tea.